We are here to do the Q&A session because we just talked all week about independent work. And I'm actually here in person with Heather. She is visiting. And so we thought it would be cool to do our independent work Q&A together with you and answer all the questions you had either during our live session or inside the Facebook group, or I actually got a few questions also on Instagram. So we kind of threw them all together and thought we would answer them here for all of you today. So we are going to get started. And the first question we have is, what are some of your favorite life skills activities to do or use? And remember, we're talking about independent work. So there can be a difference there between, having life skills that you do and work on in your classroom, but then also doing it in an independent work setting where students are obviously doing their best to do these things on their own. So Heather, what are some of your favorite life skills activities to do?
My favorite thing is everything like self-care, hygiene, grooming, self-management, everything in that. So from like toothbrushing to changing your clothes to tying your shoes to managing your backpack, all of those types of life skills I absolutely love. I feel like they're really easy to break down. They're really easy to teach. Yes, it requires a lot of repetition, but that is my favorite. What is yours?
So one of the things I actually did in my classroom over the years is I eventually just created a life skills. I called it a center station, whatever you're comfortable with, that was different from my independent workstation where I either had the bins or the drawer systems. And it was all life skills based. So I actually had a nice built-in cabinet in my classroom that had a space for hanging. So we would work on hanging clothes, showed you how do you hang pants versus shirts, folding, matching pairs of shoes, matching socks. And then I had another cabinet that had a bunch of drawers in it that I could almost simulate like a kitchen. And we work on things like, where do you put the spoons and the forks and the knives and the utensils, stacking like cookie sheets so that they actually fit inside the drawers and things like that. So those were a lot of the life skills activities. Even vacuuming. I had a little square that I took some tape and put it on the ground. And that was the area. And actually what we did is we took the hole punch holes from our hole puncher, threw them on the ground, and that's what the students would practice vacuuming. So those are some of the skills we did when it came to life skills and doing independent work in the classroom. All right, our next question is there a curriculum that you use? So I'm going to say no, because this is for independent work. I think maybe this question is geared towards curriculum, and if we need to expand or we need to answer that question in another Q&A specifically focused on the curriculum that you could use for life skills, I'm sure I can get all four of us to answer that question. Or you may want to refer back. I believe it's week 1, right, Heather, that we did curriculum. So there may already be some information in there. Go in the Facebook group, search life skills and curriculum, and you can probably find some things in there. Anything you can think of to add on that one? Okay.
I don't think there really is.
All right. Our next question, where do you get all the materials for life skills? So do you want to talk about the stuff you did?
So obviously as a new teacher, your budget is really low. Like you don't want to be buying a ton of stuff for your classroom. So I would always reach out to the teachers in my school or any of the staff in my school and be like, hey, does anybody have extra vacuum cleaner that we could use and have for the classroom? Does anybody have extra hand towels that we could use for face washing? Those types of things, and try to get like a list of things that you need and just give out an in search for. And if they can share those things, that's fantastic. That saves you some money. I also reach out to my family. And then my students' families as well. I'm like, hey, like, is there anything that you can provide for us? Beyond that, I know we could use like garage sales, yard sales, resale shops. It's funny what you can really find. And you're like, wait, I wasn't actually looking for this, but we can use this as a waste bin. And so really trying to find those smaller type of items and in lower budgets. So that's really where I go. And then Facebook Marketplace obviously could be another good place to look. So what about you?
Yeah, I used all of those things: garage sales, family members, connections in the school. I think actually at one point we needed a vacuum for that task I spoke about earlier that we did in my classroom. And so what I did is actually put a note in our faculty lounge that just said, anybody have a vacuum that they're willing to part with? Let me know. And literally 2 days later, I had a paraprofessional from another classroom that was like, hey, I have this sitting in my house and I was just going to throw it out. It works. Do you want it? And I was like, absolutely. So definitely don't feel guilty, I guess, asking for things, because sometimes you never know what you're going to get. I also used my administration to get things. We had a specific budget for our special ed program, and they allocated money for each of our classrooms, and we were able to ask for things. So I did that sometimes on top of some of the things Heather mentioned. And then the other thing I did is Donors Choose, which is a website where you can choose items and you can put it up on there if you're not familiar with Donors Choose, and then people can donate towards your classroom, kind of like an Amazon wish list, which I feel like that's becoming more popular these days as opposed to the Donors Choose. Same kind of idea. The one thing with that you have to remember though is it's a little bit more of a long-term game. Like you may not get everything. So if you start a Donors Choose today, you may not get it all fully funded to get the things you need for back to school. So you'll have to be a little patient, realizing, you know, it may take some time. However, I will say there were some companies in my local area that were looking for some ways to contribute to the community. And so I had this one, it was actually a law firm that just every time I put a project up on Donors Choose, they literally cleared it like right away for me, just because they believed in what I was doing in my classroom. I didn't know them personally. They just believed in my classroom. And anytime I had a project up there, they would fund it for me. So you just never know when you put things out there, what, you know, people will be willing to do.
Totally.
All right. Next question we have is, what can we use for early learners or functional learners besides put in tasks? So I know that in our live that we did talk a lot about if you need something for students to do, maybe when they're first starting, put in tasks are great. And just in case nobody, or in case you're not quite sure what we mean when we say a put in task, envision like a piggy bank and putting a coin inside. So that is putting something inside something else. There's lots of different ways you can set them up. And you could probably go to all of our blogs and find some examples, our Pinterest, our Instagrams, all of those. I know I've posted quite a few. I think I even have a blog post just dedicated to put in tasks. Okay, perfect. So you can go to both of our websites and look for those blogs there to get some more ideas on put in tasks. But when you have early learners, so I think of early learners as you're like pre-K to maybe like third grade, right? Like early childhood type ages. And then functional learners, in my opinion, can be any age group. They're your more students that maybe have some difficulty with fine motor skills, physical mobility, maybe some communication, even some behavioral needs that maybe hinder their ability to work independently. So when it comes to that kind of stuff, other than put in tasks, I actually like errorless. So errorless learning, if you're not familiar with what it is, and I believe we actually talked about this in the live. I think Heather, you touched on it a bit. So if you want to go check and see what Heather said about it, if you didn't see the live on this, but essentially the student can't get the answer wrong. So it may be a file folder that just has pictures of apples and they match the same exact apple on the entire page. They're not matching to different pictures. They're all matching the same picture. No chance of getting an error other than just putting it right on there. So errorless is a great way to get students started when they're first learning how to be independent, because they'll see success and then you can reinforce that and continue to get the behavior you want to see out of the students to become more independent. Do you have any other ideas or tips on that, Heather?
Yeah, so part of it too is getting student buy-in and understanding of what you're asking of them. And so I oftentimes would use a lot of leisure tasks as starting that independent work kind of thing, where a staff doesn't need to sit with them when they're playing a game or on the computer or that kind of thing. And so that we can start bringing in work demands. So we're working on that leisure and independence and that functional learning prior to giving them work, and they see it as work. It's more fun and play and leisure, even if it's just Play-Doh that you're giving to them, so that they have a moment to understand, like, this is, you can play Play-Doh for 5 minutes and I'm going to go step away, so that you can start building on that understanding of independent work.
So our next question is, how do you know that students are doing their independent work correctly and that they're actually completing the work that you're giving them? So a lot of times with independent work, right, our goal is for them to do things on their own. So I love this question because, yeah, how do you know they're doing what you want them to do if you're kind of staying back and not providing extra support or prompts or anything? How do you know they're doing it and doing it the correct way? So Heather, how do you do this?
Yeah, so it's definitely going to be data based, and you're going to have to start being a little bit closer to the students so that you can understand what they are doing. So obviously you are already taught them how to do the task. They are completing the task. So I like to have my staff either stand like kitty corner from them on an angle so they can kind of see over their shoulder, like how they're doing it, or like directly behind them. So obviously we don't know, but we want to give them space and understanding too. I've also even done it where students were like really adverse to that and I've recorded them. And so if you can like record the top of the table and see like what they're doing and how they're doing things, and then you can look back later. So it's definitely a data collection piece and kind of monitoring from a distance, but you're not like actively talking to them, you're not providing any supports, you're not trying to interfere, especially if they're doing things incorrectly. We want to teach that, so you do kind of need to monitor from a distance, just slightly. Again, I kind of look for how long is it taking them to complete the task, how correctly are they doing the task, and then is there any prompting or supports that need to be in place, or materials or items or visuals that they need in order to complete the task. So just some things to think about. But yes, there is a level of monitoring that does need to happen. Anything else?
So two other things that I can think of that can kind of help in this situation is if you're worried about if students are completing the work correctly, then prior to having them working independently on their own, before you sit them at a table, tell them to follow the schedule, grab bins and work out of them, you should have set up your expectations at the beginning of the year. So, and the more thorough, just like with any other procedure in the classroom, the more thorough you are at setting this up, the more the less intervention that child or student is going to need, or extra support they're going to need to be independent. So when I say those things, I mean things like making sure, of course, that the work is independent for the student. How do you do that? Well, sometimes you just may need to put a few different bins in front of them. I actually, the first few weeks of school, and I have a blog post about like getting it up and running and how to do this, but I would just take a table and we would put a bunch of the bins in front of the students, maybe in the center of a table. The students would all sit around it. My staff and I would then be behind the students. And this would be a situation where technically it's not independent work because we are all right there and we are focused on those students and what they are doing, but getting it set up that way first. So I could give bin, say, 11 to a student. We would have data sheets as well, like Heather was mentioning, where we'd keep track. Okay, John is working on box 11, and then we'd put the level of prompting he needed to complete it. That also gave me a list of tasks I knew I could give John on a daily or weekly, or however I did my rotation of giving those tasks. So if you're like, I don't know what things they can do independently, that's kind of the best way to do it, just to get some bins out, start doing some of the tasks. And then you can kind of apply those skills. If you know a kid can do put-ins, if you know they can match, then any matching task you have, you could probably give to that student if they already have that skill. So I think setting up your expectations is a great way to make sure kids are doing the work correctly and following the procedures that you want them to do. And then for actually completing the work, of course, everything Heather said is exactly how I would do it in my classroom as well. The other option you have is going and checking the work after they've completed it, but be sure you are mindful of that student's like confidentiality, right? So when we're opening up, say, a bin and they've completed the task, or it's a file folder that they already did the work in, we have to be careful as staff in the classroom of devaluing their work that they completed, because if they watch you take that file folder that they just spent time completing, put it back in the drawer, and you want to check their work, we don't want to be like clearing it all right in front of that student. We want to give them that dignity and that respect, because anytime, if you think of it, you did something and somebody just rips it apart and takes it down, you're like, well, then why did I do that work? So we want to be mindful. I used to have a para that would come back to the classroom after the students were out at a special, and she would come and clear all that work, or it had happened before the kids got there that day or after they left for the day, so that we didn't take away the value of that independent work the students were completing. But that's another way to check that they're completing it, is actually going in the bins and looking at the work when the students aren't there, or at least doing it discreetly so you can check on the work.
But if there are any errors and you are noticing the student is making errors, please try to correct those in the moment, or at least when that task is completed. I know I would set it up where the student would have like a start and a finished, and then when they started to move things to the finish, I would have a staff or myself come over and start checking before they totally completed all of their tasks that they had, and so that we could do some error correction if they were like, hey, let's look at this one again. And again, we're not clearing the board or clearing the task or undoing it or whatever it is, because we want to preserve that dignity. Actually, you started to kind of go into our next question, because I know we've talked about this before, about how do we train our paraprofessionals, and so you kind of talked about it with that roundtable mindset. So why don't you go in to explain that again, and how we can use our paraprofessional training while the students are learning and completing the tasks.
Yeah, so basically during that roundtable session, kids are sitting all around it. The bins are in front, usually paras and myself, we were with them behind the students. Each of us had a data sheet or a checklist of some sort with whatever task it was. We maybe had a notes section. I would also have different styles of prompts, you know, verbal, hand over hand, visual prompts, or gesture prompt, thank you. Full physical, all of that stuff, you know, and it would be in a hierarchy on that sheet. I actually think I have a freebie sheet that I shared in the Facebook group that actually has that, so you can use it if you would like to do this. And so everybody would keep track, and I did train all the paraprofessionals first. So we would have a meeting prior to doing that session with the students, and I would teach them how to fill out that data sheet. I would teach them what we were looking for. Obviously, we want to decrease as many prompts as possible. We're going to stand back and let them do as much as they can on their own. And then in the notes section, if they did the task wrong, I would want that written down. And then I would review that data to then determine what tasks they were going to complete. Same goes for in the actual independent work time, when your students are ready to sit at an area on their own and complete their work, and the paraprofessionals are watching. You're going to need to train your paraprofessionals, if you're taking data on it, which you should be, how they're going to collect, how they're going to write, what they need to check off, what do they need to circle, what are you looking for, what does it mean, did they complete the task, like what does that actually mean? And each task might have a different way of showing completion. So you're going to need to make sure your paras understand the types of tasks in your classroom and what complete actually means for you and those students, maybe even specifically, because every student may have a different style for how they complete something. So while it is an awesome thing to have an independent work task system in your classroom, it's also very individualized, which can be a little bit of work on the forefront, setting up, getting your paras trained to do that as well. Anything else I missed with training paras?
Yeah, so I would definitely introduce all the boxes to the staff before I do it with the students, so that they know which tasks are in there, and I would show them how I level them. So from errorless to put in, to matching, to sorting, to assembly, to independent living type of skills, and kind of the whole gamut, and say like, this is potentially where the students might fall, but we are going to test them out kind of in the similar format you did. And then I would do it where I would model. And so I would sit with the student and model that task with them, of like, the task is there, they do the task, how I would correct it if it is a correction thing. So I would do like a side-by-side with the student, and then the staff would kind of watch. And then, so I would do that for about a week or two, of like maybe 4 or 5 different boxes that they could see. And then I'd start pulling myself back. Or the para would also try to take data while I took data or gave prompts, and do like an I do, we do, you do type of model. And then eventually, yes, it would switch in. So between a week or 2, sometimes even 3 weeks, if they were not quite understanding what I was looking for. So it does take time. And so you said it is a lot of time and effort on the front end. So it'd be like by October or so that we would finally implement all of this. And then my paraprofessionals were just running the show. And then I was like monitoring and circling and making sure things were being run effectively as well. But that gave me an opportunity to get to see a little bit more, or if there was an isolated skill I needed to work on with a student, I could pull them to do that. And that just saved me longer in the front, because then I can pull them for IEP goals. We can pull it for baseline data. And that was something that we could do. So
yeah. All right. And our last question for today is, how do you get students to do independent work that have to have adult support? So I believe this question is, you know, okay, this is a student that cannot work independently, but that doesn't mean we want to just not have them try and get there, right? We want them to progress and be able to eventually work independently. We have talked about some tasks that may work for those students to become more independent, but when you just have a student, there are many factors that can come into play as to why a student might need adult supervision with them. It could be behavioral, it could be communication, it could be something physical, such as their fine motor skills, or their gross motor skills just aren't there to open the bins up or to do something. So, and there are different tweaks and things. So if any of you have specific questions in regards to this, I feel like you should reach out to one of us to kind of get some more help and ideas. I have had situations where I've used different storage systems for work tasks, or I didn't store things at all. We just laid the stuff on the table open, and or I had a para that would hand over the stuff on the table for the student, but they didn't have to worry about opening a bin, or I used different bins that didn't require a lid to close. Like, there's some different options. So if you do have something very specific that you have in mind on that, I recommend reaching out to one of us to kind of get that help. But in general, if a student needs adult support, I say give it to them. If that's what they need, if that's their baseline of where they are at, you give it to them. And then your goal is to fade it. You need to come up and find how can that student eventually do those tasks on their own. So if we start with errorless and put in, which is what I would probably start with the students that need the adult support, if it's just kind of a more of a behavioral or a physical ability of completing the task, or maybe it's attention span as well. In those situations, I would keep the adult there. And maybe like Heather had said earlier, where maybe you sit right next to them and you're modeling, maybe you just sit there and you just keep reminding them to stay on task. Either it's a tap on the shoulder or the hand to keep working. Sometimes we use a verbal prompt. It just depends on the situation, but come up with whatever prompt is going to be easiest for you to fade. It's definitely easier to fade a physical prompt versus a verbal. So if you can provide a physical prompt, and that could even be pointing to a visual on the student's desk that says keep working, or says, you know, just work. And then they, of course, you need to teach what that visual means to them, which takes a little bit of time as well. So those are things with the adults, you can then fade that work back. So maybe I don't tap that picture as many times. Maybe we can decrease the number of times the student needs it to start staying on task. And then I can physically take myself away from the table. So maybe I'm, like Heather had mentioned, that kind of like catty corner viewpoint where you're there, but then you slowly just keep backing that adult away as they increase their independence. And you can look at data for that in terms of number of tasks completed. You could look at time completing it independently. So maybe they can only sit for 30 seconds and complete that task for 30 seconds, but you could slowly work on building the time and the amount or that frequency of how much they're doing with that task. Or maybe you only start by having them put one item in, and then you add another one the next week after they're successful for a week doing one item in the bin. Next time you put two items in the bin. So really it's just a building game of doing it and building up that student's stamina for working independently. If that's maybe the case that you're dealing with, which a lot of times I think the attention span can be an issue when it comes to students, because they're sitting there on their own. And I know myself, like, you can get distracted very easily. So, and then fading that adult back. Anything else you can think of?
Yeah. So when I read this question, I was thinking more of students with physical disabilities that maybe like need somebody near them for medical reasons or other supports, that maybe their fine motor abilities or their gross motor abilities are not there. So I was thinking more of like collaborating with your PT and OT of like, if there's like a bilateral movement. So like if they need to take their hand and bring it across their body, or if they need to reach up high, those types of things. And that can be their independent work. Yes, it's PT, but you're also, okay, let's find the ball on the top shelf and put it in a bin. Or like we used to do laundry sorting. So they would have a pile of laundry, either towels or whatever, and they'd have to sort the colors and the whites. So maybe they were using both hands to sort. And so I was thinking things like that. If you are needing to get creative, like if it is a ball in a basket kind of thing, we used like a ball popper. It's like a big spiral thing. It's got the balls that will come through, and eventually like they'll circle through. And so then the student was taking the ball popper like toy and taking the ball, instead of a teacher giving them the ball every time, like they were taking the ball from the toy and putting it into a bin on the opposite side, or they would throw it across the room, or whatever they were working on. So again, trying to bring in some maybe PT or OTs into getting some ideas of like, okay, wiping your tray, whatever it is that you're working on, if that is the way you want to think about this question. So yeah, again, if you have any other questions or anything, you are welcome to put them in the Facebook group. And yeah, anything else?
I don't think so.
Great.
So, all right, guys. Well, thank you so much for checking out our Q&A session this week on independent work. Hopefully we answered your questions. Again, throw them in the Facebook group. If there's more that pop up from hearing us talk about these things, or if we can help you in any other way, let us know. And we will see you all on next Tuesday for next week's topic. Bye.